My name is Anke Voss, and I'm the Curator of Special Collections. I'm honored to welcome you to the Concord Free Public Library in this afternoon's program. Enslaved in the Cradle of Liberty, stories from 17th and 18th century, Concord, Lincoln, and Sudbury. Leading up to the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, many of us in Concord, but especially the cultural institutions associated with telling and interpreting Concord's history, including the Robbins House, the Concord Museum, Minuteman National Park, Concord's many historic homes and sites, and the Concord Free Public Library, are working to tell a more comprehensive and inclusive history by telling stories that focus not just on celebrating our accomplishments, and yes, there's much to celebrate, but also the often lesser told, hard, and painful truths about how this nation and our communities were built and able to prosper. The history of enslavement in New England and our communities is one of those truths that we need to tell. I'm honored to bring together a fantastic group of historians who will engage you in a conversation about enslavement in this cradle of liberty. Professor Robert A. Gross will start the program with opening remarks, followed up by presentations and a discussion on enslavement in New England, including a conversation with historians who have completed recent research on enslavement in Concord, Lincoln, Sudbury, and Wayland. Professor Gross is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Professor of Early American History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of The Minutemen and Their World, which won the Bancroft Prize, and The Transcendentalists in Their World. A revised edition of Gross's The Minutemen and Their World was published in 2022 in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Our panelists include Jane Siaka, who is a retired National Park Ranger with a degree in history education from Simmons University. Her work as an interpreter at the National Park Service in Concord, Boston, and Cambridge led her to her interest in researching enslavement and abolition in her community of Wayland. Jane has researched and presented programs on slavery, women's suffrage, and Lydia Maria Child. She's the author of Enslavement in the Puritan Village, The Untold Story, The Untold History of Sudbury and Wayland, Massachusetts. Professor Donald Hafner is the author, most recently, of Entangled Lives, Black and White, the Black Community, Enslaved and Free, of 18th century Lincoln, Massachusetts. His prior books include William Smith, Captain, Life and Death of a Soldier of the American Revolution, biography of the brother of Abigail Adams, and Tales of the Battle Road, April 19, 1775. Beth Van Duzer is an independent historian based here in Concord, Massachusetts. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from Montclair State University and a master's degree in history, focused on public history from Southern New Hampshire University. As an educator at the Concord Museum, she enjoys sharing the history of Concord with visiting students and other visitors. Beth is a co-chair and a clerk of the Concord 250 History and Education Subcommittee. Over the past 2.5 years, she has focused on identifying individuals who served in the Revolutionary War from Concord. Additionally, she owns Concord Walking Tours, a company that offers history research and guided tours. Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's program, and Welcome, Professor Gross.
Good afternoon. It's nice to see you all inside here instead of shivering in the rain. So when I was writing and researching and writing The Minutemen and Their World, it was the beginning of a great wave of scholarship on the history of slavery and African Americans that has built year after year and has yet to crest. In 1974, Eugene Genovese published Roll, Jordan, Roll. In 1975, Edmund Morgan won the Pulitzer Prize for American Slavery, American Freedom. In 1976, Herbert Gutman published The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, and you can just go on and count the books year after year after year that have won major prizes for transforming how we understand not only the racial history of our past, but how to write history itself and how to find the voices of ordinary people and of marginalized people and those who were oppressed, how to find their voices in the historical record when so many previous generations of historians said, oh, you can't write that, we don't know. They didn't leave us documents. Well, the documents were there. And much of the scholarship that began to burgeon built on the work of such notable Black historians as Lorenzo Green's Negro in Colonial New England, and the work of Benjamin Quarles, The Negro in the American Revolution, and John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom. So I came to writing about the history of Concord out of a desire to write a community study that was truly inclusive. And how could it be inclusive if you didn't include the lives and the experiences of the Black people who had been enslaved in Concord, and some of them had been freed themselves in the 18th century, or lived into 19th century Concord. So I wanted to tell their stories. I wanted to be sure that whatever my interpretation, the record was ample, and that I've been responsible in researching it. Well, the truth is, the history was hidden in plain sight. It was right there in the archives of the town, in the tax and assessment records, which listed the men who, and some women, who claimed ownership of human property and taxed them for it. It was there in the probate records of the town, of the county, in the wills in which people bequeathed ownership of human property to their heirs, and in the records of executors in the assigning of value to human beings who are going to be passed on from one person to another as master. It was there as well in the anecdotes of the social circle memoirs, often racist anecdotes, but nonetheless gave us access to a sense of the hard experience of Black people in 18th and 19th century Congress, and so on and on. And yet, we hadn't been telling those stories. Like New Englanders from the mid-19th century on had been prone to minimize the significance of slavery in the history of Massachusetts. That disguised the fact that in the 17th century, Puritan Massachusetts built its economy on its role of feeding the Caribbean islands of England and Barbados and then Jamaica. And as a major supplier, not just in the transatlantic slave trade, but a major supplier of the islands, it had built its wealth. But what it had done was outsource slavery to the plantations, profited, and then built the mansions of Beacon Hill. And at the same time, those who prospered acquired slaves, but in small numbers, one or two perhaps per household for the most part. So that if you looked at the 18th century, maybe 1.5 to 2% of Massachusetts population was black and enslaved. Concord had maybe 2 to 3 dozen enslaved people at any time in the 18th century. Lincoln similarly. So the numbers were small, and you could say, well, did that really matter? How significant was that? Well, the truth is that in some places, Boston, maybe around 1750, 12% of the population was black and enslaved. Newport, Rhode Island, a quarter. So we can't wish that away, and even when the numbers are small, they matter because of elite households in which they were held. So we need to tell that story, and the panelists today have done important work in expanding the record. And the crucial thing is, first of all, the impulse they have to documenting the history, to finding places where you could have seen and recorded and made sense of the presence of black people. So I want to conclude my opening remarks by reflecting for just a minute or two on why we need to document, why there's a moral imperative as well as a quest for truth in the documentation urge. Well, for one thing, it's pretty clear that for our time, we need to tell stories about the past that can express what we know to be the contradictions between our ideals and our practices. The racial legacies that we inherit, we still struggle with today. We struggle to live up to our ideals of equality and liberty. And how can we go back to a past and simplify it, notwithstanding the president's desire to turn the Smithsonian into a test case of how successfully denial will go over today? So there's a moral imperative to document, to find in the past a way to understand the contradictions of the present. And there's also, I think, an important impulse to look for the origins of a multicultural, multiracial society, to see, at least in the beginnings, a society much like our own today. We write history both to be accountable to and responsible for empathetically reconstructing the lives of people who've come before, who didn't know they were going to lead to us. And if they did, they would have turned around and gone back somewhere where they came from. We need to try to be accountable to that past, but also to see if we can understand the ways in which people in the past lived with diversity or couldn't live with it. And could we learn from that? So as you listen to the presentations, I urge you to consider a couple questions in the back of your mind. One is, how typical were Concord and Lincoln, Sudbury and Wayland of Massachusetts small towns? Or was there anything distinctive about their experience that arises as you listen and you think, does that make Concord different from other places or Sudbury? And what do we know differently about the American Revolution by taking into account the history of slavery and the experiences of black people, both in slavery and as soldiers in the Continental Forces and the Massachusetts armies? How do we reinterpret the history of the Revolution when we know that a great many of its leaders were slaveholders? But we might also want to reflect that Massachusetts is the first state to abolish slavery through court decisions and to abolish it with no compensation immediately. And it did so while some people may have resisted. But it hit me today preparing these remarks that nobody in Massachusetts ever organized a political movement to overturn that court decision. Surely the absence of any political organizing suggests how much the end of slavery was in accord with the inhabitants' desires. Thank you.
And thank you. I'm Jane Siaka, and I'm the one who wrote about enslavement in Sudbury and Wayland, which I'll explain in a few minutes. I'm glad to see everyone here coming out of the rain and snow. And I want to take a moment to thank Anka, because this is her brainchild. And she put a lot of effort and thought into doing this. And I hope that you will relax once you realize that you are reaping the benefits of your thoughts. I'd also like to take a minute to thank, in particular, my family and friends. Some of you are here today who have been on this journey of mine for almost as long as I have. So I'm here where it all started for me, and that is in Concord. When I came in the mid-1980s as a docent at the Old Manse. I can't say it was required reading, but you had to be pretty foolish not to read The Minutemen and Their World by Professor Gross. And even though he had written it for the bicentennial, but he did mention the fact that there were enslaved people in Concord at the start of the Revolution. And that was eye-opening to me. I had grown up in the North, in New York, in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, knew nothing until I read that book. And to me, slavery was a Southern phenomenon. So I thank you for doing that. And then I went on from the Old Manse. I worked at Minuteman National Historical Park. And there I encountered a book. It was Vanity Press published. It was quite expensive, around 1990, over $30, I think it was, although I got my Eastern discount. And it was Lorenzo Green's The Negro in Colonial New England. I have worn out 3 copies of that book. So I am on it. And it just showed me that enslavement was not just a local affair. It wasn't just in Concord at the beginning of the Revolution, but it was pervasive throughout New England. And then I moved on to the Wayside part of Minuteman National Historical Park, where I nominated the house as for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And in addition to abolition, I also was well aware of the fact there had been enslaved people who lived at the Wayside, not called that, in colonial times. So, but I always wondered why my home, Wayland, just a few miles from Concord, why there were no enslaved people living there, because I had lived there for 15 years. I was very involved in the Wayland Historical Society, and surely I would have known it if it was there. And Wayland, and I'll explain this. So if I'm clever enough to know how to do this, sure. If you put me up, I'll do it.
Yeah, yeah, good.
Thank you. Okay. Am I there? There I am. It's coupled. This is the cover of the book. Thank you, Anka, so much.
I'm just there you go.
Okay, this is the cover of the book. I've coupled it with a quote by Lydia Mariah Child, who lived in Wayland for 27 years. She's someone I studied. She wrote a book in 1833 about, not just about enslavement of people who had slaves, but also about humanity. And so the quote is, while we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the system of slavery, let us not flatter ourselves that we are in reality any better than our brethren in the South. Thanks to our soil and climate and the early exertions of the Quakers, the form of slavery does not exist among us, but the very spirit of the hateful and mischievous thing is here in all its strength. And she wrote this talking about the South, but part of me thinks that she would be happy that I did what I did to uncover it right where she lived. The book title is Enslavement in the Puritan Village, The Untold History of Sudbury and Wayland. And today, Sudbury and Wayland are two fiercely independent towns. I think as far as their early history is concerned in particular, somebody's shaking her head. But at that time, from its founding in 1639 until 1780, Sudbury and Wayland were one town. So this whole period that I talk about is both towns. They did not separate. And it was a large town. It was just founded 3 years later than Concord on the same river, and it had a population at that time of about 2,000 people. So it was not a small town, the second largest in Middlesex County after Charlestown. So this prompted me. So why is this the Puritan village? So that's one mystery, Wayland and Sudbury. I will call it Sudbury because that was the name of the town until the separation. But it came from another book, so now and that is Where Did It Get Its Name? From Sumner Chilton Powell's 1964 Pulitzer Prize winning history, and it was called The Puritan Village. So there is a reason why it's the Puritan Village, which traces the formation of a New England town from the old world to the new, using colonial Sudbury, modern Wayland and Sudbury, as the model for other towns. And as he said in his introduction, one town well documented in relation to its specific origins can serve as a representative study for most New England towns until further investigation takes place. And so I think that it was calling to me. And I started reading anything I could get my hands on about slavery in the North. And yes, as you have said, it's few and far between. And especially loved Lorenzo Green's book, which was written by a Black professor, by the way, in 1942, teaching at Lincoln University in Missouri. But I started reading everything I could, and one of the first things I would do when I had those books was look up if Sudbury was mentioned. And lo and behold, I saw almost nothing that talked about Sudbury. There is a book written in 1889 called Huston's History of Sudbury, in which there is one page out of over 600 pages that devotes itself to something that he called servants, a euphemism that was even being used at the end of the 19th century for slaves. So, and so this was all over the course of 30 years. I decided I wanted to find out about Wayland and Sudbury enslavement, and so I was working full-time, devoting myself to Concord, basically, and I started compiling a notebook and copying anything I could find that had to do with enslavement in Sudbury. One of the beautiful gifts that the town of Sudbury gave is starting in 1991. They started to digitize the town records. And it was called the Sudbury Archives. It's just a treasure. Even around 2000, when I Googled it, I got about 10 hits for slaves. So that was just a bonanza. But basically, other than that in town records, I just could not find very much that had to do about Sudbury. So what I offer are stories, and some of them even involve people who had connections to other towns, and stories that have never been told before. At least I haven't seen them recorded in any way. And whether it was exclusively in Sudbury or if it involved another town, for example, and you have to look at other towns. I found out that was a lesson I learned. So that, for example, there was a sale of a 2-year-old child, Phoebe, by Josiah Richardson, sold to the widow Balsh in Framingham, and her bill of sale is not in Sudbury, it is in Framingham. And so another one that I've come across, and I don't know how to, okay, maybe so this is one that has to do with Concord, and it is this, oh, you could see this is not my strong suit, in case you were wondering. My son wouldn't be wondering. He's laughing. I see him. So the sale of Francis or Frank Benson in 1745 for 200 pounds during his natural life. So Frank or Francis Benson started his life in Framingham. He was enslaved to the Reverend John Swift, the first minister of Framingham. And when Reverend Swift died in 1745, he was bequeathed to his son and namesake, Reverend John Swift of Acton. Reverend Swift of Acton apparently did not need or want Frank or Francis. In Sudbury, he's more known as Francis. In Concord and other places, he is known as Frank. So I'll tend to use Frank a little more. And so he was sold to Josiah Richardson and Sudbury. So he lived there until well, when Josiah Richardson died in 1770, he was still enslaved to that family. So that is the beginning. And then later, his story comes full circle. Well, not quite, but he has another stop, and that is that he is identified as having been enslaved to the Reverend William Emerson on the first day of the American Revolution. And then there is later, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but here is someone who has a history that if you just looked at one town, you will miss 25, 30 years of his life, his marriage, his first marriage, and everything else. So I tried to bring these stories to life, and that is, and sort of fill in some of the blanks, as well as telling stories that have not been told before. So I guess I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
If I could press you into service again.
Oh, thank you,
I've also discovered that Dr. Franklin's invention of these multiple lenses is really a wonderful one.
There you go.
I also want to begin by thanking Anka. What she has arranged for today and also presented to you is something very rare in two ways. One of them is that we have three communities here to talk about similarities and differences. And that in and of itself very infrequently occurs. Usually it's one or the other of us who get invited someplace, and there we are. The other thing that is important is that these are three rural communities. And I want to emphasize to you that only 5% of the Massachusetts population lived in Boston. 95% of Massachusetts was rural back then. Almost everything, not everything, but almost everything that has been written about slavery in Massachusetts is urban slavery. It is not rural slavery. And so, as I say, this is a rare opportunity for you. When I started this project, I was under no illusions about the challenges that I was facing. My aim was to gather as much information as possible about Lincoln's black residents during the 18th century. And most important, I didn't come to it with any hypothesis, no academic notion about that was going to induce me to tell them how they should have understood their lives. I wanted them to speak to me, and then I wanted to tell their stories. I was able to trace, at least in part, 36 of the black residents of Lincoln during the 18th century. Up to the Revolution, a little bit beyond. There were another 10 black residents whose existence I know, but I know nothing more in many instances. I don't even know their name. I just simply know that they are recorded someplace as having been there. The entanglement of black and white lives in 18th century Lincoln is much greater than the size of Lincoln itself might suggest, or the population, black population. There were tallies of black residents in all of Massachusetts, and particularly in Lincoln and the surrounding towns, in 1754, and again in 1765, and then in Lincoln I have the tally in 1774. And what they show is a fairly steady black population in Lincoln of about 20 or 30 black adults, both free and enslaved, although the majority of them were enslaved. Plus, and I need to note this to you, these censuses do not apparently record children. And so there's a larger black population there than might necessarily be seen. You'll also notice, of course, that black men outnumbered black women significantly, although the percentages vary. Now, 20 to 30 black residents in the town of Lincoln, which during this period had a population of about 610 to 775. That may not seem like much, but to Bob Gross's point, most of these black adults lived singly in a household. The average household in Lincoln during this period had 7 people in it. That means that somewhere between 150 and 200 white residents in Lincoln lived in a house with a black person. Not a neighbor, not somebody they ran into in the market or in the church, in the same house. And those of you who have been in 18th century houses know that living was very intimate. There was very difficult moving away from anybody. These are the houses in Lincoln, the circles around them, the houses that had an enslaved person in them. As you can see, they are scattered around the town, and what is stunning about them is that they are numerous. Hundreds more white residents mingled with their black neighbors at mandatory church service, in the fields, in the workshops, and of course during marketing days, both within Lincoln and elsewhere. But also note to you that the percentage of black people in Lincoln as a percentage of the population was twice that of Concord or Sudbury. So again, the intimacy was quite pervasive there. And given how wide the contact was between whites and blacks in Lincoln in the 18th century, what is really rather striking is the utter absence of records of their mere existence. It takes a lot of digging to find out who these people were. I was able to fill in the story in the greatest detail of the Oliver family, and particularly of the oldest daughter of the Oliver family, Mary Oliver. And here I'm departing from our theme. The Oliver family were free blacks, not enslaved. Tracing Mary Oliver's life, her parents were an interracial couple. Her father was black, her mother, a free black man. Her mother was white. And in tracing her life, it illuminates some of the character and the complexity of rural black communities, and also something of the differences between enslaved blacks and those who were free. So let me tell you just a couple of the stories about Mary Oliver and her circumstances and the puzzles that her story raises. In 1761, Mary Oliver married Jack Thayer of Stoneham. How was this romance possible? Stoneham is a considerable distance from Lincoln. Mary Oliver was 19 years old. When they got married, she probably was pregnant. That would not distinguish her in 18th century New England. Jack Thayer was enslaved. He was enslaved in the prosperous household of a man in Stoneham. Jack's age, I do not know, but I can tell you he must have been very charming. As I mentioned, Mary is 19 years old. Jack is undoubtedly older. I believe he was shorter than Mary Oliver, and he was missing his front teeth. He must have been charming. Anyway, so Stoneham is 13 miles from Lincoln. That's a 3-hour ride by cart or by horse. It's 4 hours by foot each way. The wonder isn't just that Jack managed this long-distance courtship so he could persuade Mary Oliver to get married, but the question is, how on earth do they meet in the first place? Let me note to you, that's the distance we're talking about there between Lincoln and Stoneham. It is not trivial. It's not a rare case either, and I'm going to turn to Sudbury just so that you have another example. Dinah was enslaved in the household of Josiah Richardson that Jane mentioned in East Sudbury, what was East Sudbury then. That was 7 miles from Lincoln. Again, that's a 2-hour walk or ride by horse. It was unfortunately a short-lived marriage. She married Caesar. Caesar lived in Lincoln. He was enslaved in Lincoln. They were never allowed to live together. That was fairly common. But they did have a son about a year later. And then, much tragedy, Caesar died 4 days after his son was born. Dinah stayed unmarried for some considerable period of time. She remained enslaved in the Richardson household, and then her son died at the age of 11. So Dinah stayed in the Richardson household after that, but she was freed by the Richardsons shortly during the war. And then in 1781, she married again. And this time she married Cuff Nealon. Well, Cuff had previously been enslaved again in Lincoln. He was a neighbor of Dinah's first husband, Caesar. Cuff, unfortunately, also died relatively shortly after the marriage. Now, 2 years later, Dinah married again. She married to Cato Walker, a free black man who himself had recently been widowed and was living and had a son that he was a young son that he was bringing up. Cato Walker lived in Worcester, 40 miles away. How on earth did they ever meet and maintain this courtship that led to marriage? The remarkable aspect of these stories is the ability of black couples to form and to sustain these marriages despite distances, despite generally being denied the ability to live together. When I say it's a puzzle, I mean it's a puzzle in the sense that it reminds us of how little we know about the lives and the society of black communities in rural Massachusetts. These people lived in those communities intimately, and we know virtually nothing about them. There was socializing, of course, mandatory church attendance, and blacks were expected to attend church as well. There were black residents were, of course, assigned to the back of the pews if there were only a single floor, or to the gallery. That provided some opportunity for socializing. There was also an opportunity for socializing on market days and so on. But those are local networks. They're not 40 miles away to Worcester or 13 miles away to Stoneham. And yet those connections occurred. How is it possible? There's a second example of how Mary Oliver's story illuminates rural black communities. Mary Oliver had tried to live near her husband, Jack Thayer, in Stoneham, but was warned out by Stoneham and put on a cart and sent back to Lincoln. Are you aware of the practice of warning out? Do I need a quick explanation, or you know the procedure? Okay. Well, Lincoln was not in favor of this either, although it was technically responsible for Mary because she had been born and raised in Lincoln. So the town was responsible. But it got a court order, packed Mary Oliver back on a cart and sent her back to Stoneham. There followed a 4-year battle between Stoneham and Lincoln over who was going to be responsible for Mary Oliver and where she was going to live. Mary Oliver and Jack Thayer during that time had 3 children. Finally, the court decided Lincoln was responsible for Mary Oliver, and so she and her 3 children were packed again into a cart and sent back to Lincoln. Jack remained enslaved in Stoneham. Now, Mary Oliver's own mother probably was still living in Lincoln, and her older brothers and such, but we can imagine, in addition to her mother, that Mary Oliver probably would have sought companionship and maybe some guidance in managing motherhood from the small circle of adult black women in Lincoln. The problem was this, the difference. All these women in Lincoln were enslaved. None of them were married. None of them had children. Despite a colonial law which said that enslavers were not to impede the marriages of their black servants, as the term was at that time. Despite that, I have found, at least in my experience in looking at Lincoln and some of the other towns, that marriage and child rearing among rural enslaved black women was in fact fairly rare. And that leads to a puzzle as to why that might be so. Well, let me suggest to you why that might be so. If I move out here, excuse me, I went too far. There. Take a look at those. These are black children being given away. A Negro child 3 months old to be given away, a female Negro child 6 weeks old to be given away, a likely Negro child about 1 month old, a likely healthy Negro child a week old. I came across an advertisement in a Boston newspaper to give away a black child who was not yet born, but would be, in the phrase of the advertisement, soon to be delivered. Even if an enslaved black woman might reconcile herself to a marriage in which she would never live in the same household with her husband, how would a woman justify to herself bringing into the world children who would then be snatched from her as little as a week or a month away from birth, snatched away from her and given into slavery in the same circumstances that she knew so intimately in her own life? Even free black women, like, I'm sorry, this is not responding the way I would like it to. Let me just say, even free black women like Mary Oliver could have their children taken away from her, and in fact Mary Oliver's children were taken away from her. The reason was that Jack remained enslaved in Stoneham. His enslaver would not allow him to earn enough outside of the household so that he could support Mary and the children. She therefore fell upon the town of Lincoln, because she was essentially impoverished, fell upon the town of Lincoln, and the town of Lincoln selectmen did what was perfectly legal back then. In the case of a pauper parent, they took Mary Oliver's children away from her and sent them out as apprentices in white households. In most instances, the apprenticeship technically meant that these were children who were to be trained in the skills that would be necessary for adult life. It is fairly clear that they were essentially just household staff. The difference between enslavement and the apprenticeship was minimal, with the exception that they were to finally be freed by the time, in the case of girls, by the age of 18, in the case of men, by the age of 21. Boston selectmen attempted to go even further. Boston selectmen attempted to have a law, it may have been passed, I've not seen that it was enforced, a law that all black parents, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved, regardless of whether they were impoverished or not, it did not matter. All black parents were to place their children in apprenticeships with white families at or by the age of 4. All the Oliver sons, Mary's brothers, volunteered for military service during the war. The oldest 2 volunteered even though they were already married and had children. They did not have to go. When the war began, there were roughly 68,000 white males aged 16 and over who were eligible for military service, and there were roughly 3,000 black males over the age of 16. I would note to you, interestingly enough, a larger percentage of black adult males in Massachusetts served in the Army during the war than the percentage of white males served in the Army during the war. The question that has puzzled historians, because we have so little documentary evidence to go on, it's also puzzled me, and that is, why did they serve? This was not a society which, after all, had placed them in high esteem. There's all this prattle going on among these people who call themselves patriots about being reduced to slavery. Well, guess what? So why did they serve? And that puzzled me. Often an answer which is given is, well, if they were enslaved, they could serve and perhaps earn their freedom. I'm not persuaded by that. But in any case, in the case of the Oliver brothers, they were already free. Why did they serve? It seems to me, I can only speculate, but what I can say is it seems likely that black men, both free and enslaved, black men served in the military because the military, in fact, brought them a dignity that they did not find in society. The Army was completely integrated in the ranks of the private soldiers. Blacks could not be officers, but otherwise, the Army was completely integrated. They bunked in the same barracks with whites, they ate the same food as whites, they were assigned the same responsibilities as whites, they died in camp at the same rates as whites. So in all respects, with the exception of being excluded from being officers, they were treated equal. Where else would they have found that? The price of that dignity for the Oliver brothers and the Oliver family was extreme. The Olivers were the only Lincoln family to lose 2 sons during the war to military service. So slavery in Massachusetts, of course, did not survive long after the Revolutionary War, as Bob Gross has noted. And in part, that was because slavery became legally suspect under the new Massachusetts Constitution adopted after the war. But more to the point, during the war and after, many slaves simply liberated themselves. They walked away. Guess who owned slaves? They tended to be loyalists. If they fled the colony during the Revolution, they were not going to be taking their black resident or their servants with them in the main. So it was an particularly in Lincoln, the largest collection of black residents, black enslaved, were on the estate of the Russell family. And when Dr. Charles Russell fled after April 19th, because he realized being a loyalist in Lincoln was probably not a good idea, he fled. He did not take his staff with him. They just simply walked away. Elise Lemire has written a wonderful book about them, which is Black Walden, because many of them went from that estate over to Walden Pond and settled in a black community. So many of the slaves just simply walked away. But in any case, neither the authorities nor society in general in Massachusetts after the war saw much interest in sorting out who were the free black men wandering around because they've been liberated, who are the ones who were supposedly still enslaved, who were all of these people, which ones were enslaved and should be returned to their owners, where are their owners anyway? In general, the conclusion was this is slavery, we're not going to enforce slavery any longer. It is simply not going to be done. In 1795, the Reverend Jeremy Belknap was asked to assess the situation of black residents after slavery had ended in Massachusetts, and here you can see his remarks. Some are industrious and prudent, and a few have acquired property, but too many are improvident and indolent. Jeremy Belknap was not a very reflective fellow. If he had been, he might have asked why black residents were unable to build reserves of wealth and acquire property and cease to be improvident, and that so few of them would have had property. But to Belknap, the explanation, as you can see, was, well, it's all a result of character flaws in black residents. Not the effects, apparently, of 150 years of slavery during which they were systematically deprived of the benefits of their labor. No, it was character flaws. And so the Reverend Jeremy Belknap proposed a solution. They should go back and work for their former white enslavers. And in Lincoln, in this first federal census in 1790, the black community, once stable at 25, 30 people, had been reduced to 6. They were all living in the households of their former enslavers. They continued to live entangled lives, black and white, not fully free, in 18th century Lincoln, Massachusetts. Thank you.
All right, let's see if I can do this. Anka?
Yes.
Yeah. See, it's so much better. And while she does this, we'll say thank you to Anka again. We can't thank her enough. You're so awesome. Yay! And I also want to say thank you to Bob Gross. Bob Gross knows my name. Like, I email him and he emails me back. He is so kind and he is so generous with his time and with his knowledge. So thank you, Bob. You're wonderful. All right. And this is really just my presentation. All I need is Concord, right? That's very Concord. It's so Concord. So first, let's talk about Concord in the 1600s. What happened in Concord, who lived here, were there enslaved people? So Musketequid was renamed Concord by English colonists in 1635 when it became the first inland settlement where one could no longer smell the ocean air. The colonial period for Concord started with the colonists who first started living here, and the colonial period ends here with the American Revolution. Who knows what date that is? You can shout it out. April 19th, 1775, kind of the rest of the world says July 4th, 1776. But, I need a nice round number, so we're gonna say it's 75 so I can get 140 years out of this, right? So what documents survive from the 1600s here in Concord? And unfortunately, it's not a lot. Not a lot mention enslavement that do survive, and they're scattered. They're located in different repositories, and our history is spotty at best. For Concord, there are no known tax records that survive from the 1600s. The town book for that period is incomplete, and it really leaves today's researchers looking for other types of documentation. So what is it that Ben Franklin said about nothing being certain but death and taxes? So if taxes are out, death is in. So another place I look are probates. And if you know the name of a person who died in Concord in the 1600s, and if there was an inventory of their estate filed in their probate, there's a really good chance you can find some information on people. And sometimes these documents are online, and sometimes they're in libraries, archives, and museums. So if anyone has ever read Ruth Wheeler's Climate for Freedom, she mentions 2 servants of Peter Bulkeley's, one who is Black and the other is Indigenous. I did find these 2 individuals mentioned for Peter Bulkeley. He dies May 24th, 1688. On this receipt of funeral expenses, it's dated the next day after his death. And this is in special collections, and it was framed years ago, right? Yeah, framed years ago, but you can see this document in special collections. And it gives us a little more information about the people of his household. And if we zoom in, we have on the top, it has the date, it tells us about his coffin. There's gonna be some wine and cider involved in this funeral. And then further down on the page, it does mention someone who is called John Indian, and the other person is a black servant. And then, oh, don't do that, Beth. And then if we go to his probate inventory, there's 53 pages available online. His inventory is more than this one page. There are no enslaved people listed in this inventory. But further in the probate, there is a receipt that lists clothes that are made the receipt is dated June 12, 1688, so about 3 weeks after Bulkley's death. And one of them again is for John Indian and one is for the other enslaved/servant. So I look at 30 other probates for men and women who died in Concord in the 1600s. None of the 30 documents in their probate inventory listed enslaved people. So I haven't looked at other communities, and I don't know if this is common for that period or not, if they have already taken care of passing along their property, which were people. So that's, if we just look at one probate receipt, we look at one funeral receipt, it doesn't give us the whole story. Kind of like with social media today. If you look at one post from somebody, it doesn't tell you everything about them. This doesn't tell you everything about these individuals either. So in addition to death and taxes, I looked at Middlesex County court records and found a record that's dated April 1, 1679, stating that Philip, the black servant of Captain Timothy Prout of Concord, and Margaret Priest, his servant maid, were convicted by their own confession of committing fornication. And they had a bastard child, says so. And they were sentenced to be whipped 10 stripes apiece or pay 40 shillings apiece. And Captain Prout makes a motion and requests that Philip was abated 10 shillings. So he was obviously not whipped. He was paying a fine. Notice it doesn't mention that Margaret Priest is black. So she's not, because they would tell us if she was. And I was unable to find a record of her birth, but I found one of her death that listed her as one of Concord's town poor. She dies March 19th, 1709/10. So 30 years after being convicted and sentenced for having a child out of wedlock, Margaret Priest died in Concord. I did not find any record of her child. Timothy Prout was kind of a big deal. Research him on your own. And when he died, he was of Boston, according to his probate. Did he still have an enslaved person in 1702? There's not one listed in his inventory, but within the last will and testament, which is what is on the screen, it does list this unnamed black person that clothes are to be left to. Probably the same person. So what all this evidence, and what I've spent 5 minutes doing, is telling you that we need more evidence. We cannot define what enslavement looked like during the first part of the 1600s with these fragments of information. But what I can talk about are the 1700s. So the earliest tax record I found that exists for the town of Concord in the town of Concord archives is from 1712. So that is 77 years after the official founding of the colonial town, and that means we are missing the first 77 years of documents. No one on this assessment is listed as being taxed for an enslaved person, but if you look through the top, there's a real estate tax, there's a personal tax, and there's a total tax. So personal estate is where your enslaved person would be, and it's not broken out in future years, they break it out. So it's impossible to know how they created this if someone has an enslaved person because there's nothing listed on the side saying so. The next tax assessment that exists from the town of Concord is from 1717. That's 5 years later. And after that, 5-year gap again. The next one is 1722. Because records are missing, it's impossible to know without a doubt how much information on enslaved people we are missing. And then, whoop, come back. Don't look at the chart. Oh my gosh, come on, go back. There we go. Don't look at the chart. Okay, there we go. So to make it more difficult, assessments were broken down into quarters. How many quarters are in a dollar? 4. How many quarters should Concord have? Well, should we have? Not how many do we have? Don't give away the answer. So we should have 4 quarters. Bob, how many do we have? 3. Yeah. So you see we have the East, the North, the South. What's missing? West, yeah, West Concord. So yeah, for some years, sorry, documentation for all the quarters exist, but not all. It makes piecing together the history of enslavement more like a puzzle with missing pieces. And a lot of the tax assessments use the word Negro. Some of them use the word slave. If you had more than one enslaved person, there's a number next to it. There is never a name associated with the enslaved person being assessed. In 1717, there were 2 enslaved people listed on the tax assessment. Now we can look. Over time, the number grew. From 1749 to 51, there were about 35 enslaved people assessed in Concord. For those years, Chambers Russell from Lincoln was still part of Concord. And he was listed as enslaving anywhere from 5 to 6 individuals. Lincoln was incorporated as a town in 1754. Chambers Russell lived on land that became part of Lincoln. So it's not surprising in this chart that you see the number of enslaved decreases in population as the population of Concord decreases, right? In 1771, there's about 15 enslaved people listed in Concord. In 72, 16. And the last listing of enslaved people being assessed on taxes in Concord is the year 1776. And in 1776, there were 12 enslaved people listed. There was also one free Black property-owning woman listed that year. So starting in 1777, no enslaved people were listed as taxed on the books, is what I call it. There are only 44 years of records available for the colonial period of Concord, so 31%, less than a third. And of those years, they're not complete. With the little bit of evidence I found, we have at least 106 men and women who enslaved other people. And I figured it's so far about 140 separate individuals were enslaved. So that number is staggering, it's heavy. There's a lot of people. But the taxes don't tell the whole story. I looked at probates. Probates sometimes provide more information on those who were listed on the tax assessments, or probates list enslaved individuals who were not listed on the taxes, and it increased the numbers of enslavers and enslaved slightly, and usually it's children. So for example, in 1777, there were 2 enslaved people listed. You can see Lieutenant Daniel Dean on the top. He has a tax assessed for real estate, 2 horses, 2 oxen, 5 cows, 6 sheep, and an enslaved person. Then we have Richard Cates, who also had real estate, 1 horse, 2 cows, and 1 enslaved person. Richard Cates died in 1818, and he left behind a detailed last will and testament. Oh, wrong way. Hold on. Detailed. Okay, this is scanned in as 2 separate pages, a left half and a right half. I literally bought a new computer monitor to look at this so I could see it together on one page. And this document lists the name of Wally. So Wally was enslaved by Richard Cates. He was about 15. And he was supposed to spend, this document says, the next 6 years serving Widow Cates before being delivered to a kinsman for another 10 years to learn the trade of a glazier. And that's someone who's responsible for cutting, fitting, and installing glass panes into windows. So after learning the trade, finally, Wally was to be given his freedom. There are pages in the probate 7 years later, so when he should have been in his apprenticeship, that state that a debt was paid to the estate of Richard Cates, and they wanted to use the money to buy clothing for Wally, which he desperately needed. So we know he was still alive 7 years after the death of Richard Cates, but I kind of lose him to history, and I need to do more research, because was he ever given his freedom? It'd be great to know. Then in 1724, we have John Miles, who was assessed for an enslaved person. John Miles dies in 1725. And in his probate, an enslaved indigenous man was valued at 38 pounds. The indigenous man became ill, was treated by a doctor, and subsequently died. The estate paid for him to be buried, because it says so on the very bottom. But but it doesn't say where. John Miles was buried in South Burying Ground, so kind of across the street. This way? That way. That way, good. That way, okay, good. So yeah, so it's very possible this individual was buried there too. Then 1732, Ebenezer Hunt was listed as being assessed for one enslaved person. And this time a document from a book on deeds gave me more information about the person enslaved in the Hunt household. So if you think about it, has anyone here ever looked for their property, especially what happened in town recently? Middlesex County deeds to see? Yeah, seriously. Anyone see what they own their property, what that is? We think of land as being property. Your enslaved person was property. It's not unheard of to find enslaved people listed in the books for the land properties. So, in 1736, Ebenezer and Sarah Hunt created a legal document to protect the future of Peter, their enslaved man, and it promised Peter his freedom. It says so on the right-hand side, right? Give him his freedom. Then you turn the page in the book, and you turn it too much. And it says, after their death. I was like, you guys are so great, almost great. So it raises a question, right? Because Ebenezer dies in 1749. I could not find a probate for Sarah. Did Peter outlive his enslavers? Was he really given his freedom? What happens to him? So these little snippets of history, right, our little fragments that we have help to give us more information from the tax assessments, but it's still not the entire story. And finally, I'm just going to jump forward in history because I want to touch on some people who were formerly enslaved and then they become free and they are listed on our tax assessments. So the first name we have is John Jack. He first appears on a tax assessment in 1765. When he dies, he leaves his property to Violet. Violet inherits it. In John Jack's probate, there is a legal document from Violet and a lawyer from Lincoln saying, hey, there's this guy by the last name of Bliss, and he was handling this, but he kind of had to leave town because he was a loyalist, right? So can we finish this up? And Violet inherits the land and belongings of John Jack, and she is listed on tax assessments multiple times. Then we have three patriots of color. Brister Freeman, Caesar Robbins, and Charlestown Eads were all enslaved. They all take part in the Revolutionary War, and then they all live here in Concord, and they own property, and they pay taxes. And then we have Thomas Dugan, who was enslaved in Virginia for about the first 40 years of his life. He gains his freedom, and he chooses to live the second 40 years of his life here in Concord as a free man. So these are just some of the stories of people, enslaved and then free, and eventually we have the freeborn, of who is here in Concord. Okay? All right. Where do you want to go? You want to sit in the center?
Oh,
You look so pretty though. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Let me just bring the mic
Are there instructions?
No, it's just left.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? I might need to, all right. On the top.
oh. Makes good sense.
Yeah,
And the switch is?
right up there.
So Jane,
Got
Wait,
it.
I'm working on it.
yeah, it's okay.
I got it.
So for the last half hour, Jane, Beth, and Don have agreed to answer some questions that we all together decided were important to us and we thought would be important to you. But then we also, I know Bob has a few questions, or Professor Gross has a few questions that he would like to add to things we should be considering, and hopefully there'll be some time for you all to maybe pose some yourself. So I was just going to start out by, and you choose the order you want to answer them in, and if there's a question you want to skip, that's fine. But so the first question I had for you all was, what type of records did you use to document the stories of enslavement? So it's great, Beth, that yours was our last presentation. And why are records so scarce? So again, what kind of records did you use to tell your stories, or the stories of enslavement? And what would you tell somebody about why records are so scarce?
I can answer that. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? They're not as scarce as they're reported to be. You just have to look hard to find them. There may be snippets of records, and those snippets can be in a variety of places. So one of the families that was very important to what I did was the Benson family. And I talked about Frank Benson, but the Benson family story goes from Framingham to includes Acton, as I mentioned. It includes Concord. It includes Lincoln. And the missing part of it was the Sudbury portion of their lives. And to do that, I pieced together, to get the whole story, vital records. I pieced together in Concord, in Sudbury. I also pieced together, which was a blessing because they also were involved with the Harry family who intermarried with the Bensons. And for that, I had the medical records that are at Harvard Countway Library, where Ebenezer Roby, the town doctor, documented and gave the price for all the cares that he took. And that is where I actually found out who was related to whom, because it would say I cared for his sister, and I didn't know they were related until I read that. But the blessing of all in Sudbury is the journals of Israel Loring, who was minister of Sudbury for 66 years. And yes, and he kept a journal. He kept a journal in which, or journals in which he detailed the lives of his own enslaved people, and he also detailed the lives of other people's enslaved people. It is from Israel Loring that we find out about the enslaved man of Josiah Brown intentionally shooting himself with a gun and almost taking his life. So these are just treasures that we would not have. And I give some credit for my book to the copious journals and notes that were incredible, that were kept by Reverend Israel Loring. And besides town records, of course, probate records are fabulous. Church records are wonderful. Some of them, you just get a piece here and a piece there, and it's not until you've gathered enough pieces that you actually have a whole story, or at least as much of it as has surfaced to this time.
There also are great gaps that occur. In Massachusetts, nobody ever did anything without being paid. And so there were laws that required the payment to the town clerk for having the town clerk record basic information about births, marriages, and deaths. If you didn't pay, and so that was the law. the law recurs so often in the colonial records that it's pretty clear it is not being obeyed. But there were certain people who were required, and it was difficult for them not to obey. Churchmen who married people or did baptisms were required to pay for having that recorded. So church records can actually be quite good. The problem is that the Congregational Church was not particularly friendly to black people. And so in Lincoln, for instance, I'm hard-pressed to find, trying to think right now, hard-pressed to find more than one marriage done in the church, though there were more marriages than that. And with respect to births, there are a few baptisms, but generally only if the white enslaver thought it was important to have the child baptized. Even the baptism records don't necessarily tell us the age of the child who is being baptized, so we're left without that as well. Again, I suspect it is generally the case that the records in Boston on these things are much better than they are in the rural countryside. So we end up being left. Another useful source are the records, the military records that have been assembled for all of the men who served in the Revolution. And those are terrific. One of them that I came across, which was especially useful, it's 17 volumes, so it's a lot to go through. But one of the sets that I came across had been, there was a little trail left by a prior researcher. I have no idea who it was, but there was a penciled check mark next to every black man who was in the records.
Nice.
And so, you live for days like that.
Actually, so can I ask Bob to tell a story?
Yeah.
So okay, so Bob emailed me this story once. So the records in Concord, when you had graduate students here, and how you found them, it's a good story.
So,
Why are things scarce? Yeah.
the records that Beth has been examining were not available to me when I did the Minutemen in their world. But as I was waiting for the Minutemen in their world to appear in print, and living in Concord at 34 Thoreau Street with my wife Ann and our little child Matt, as we were waiting, I was serving on the town Records and Archives Committee. A man named Robert Needham was the chair of the committee, and I put to him the following question. How is it that in the 1880s, Massachusetts had a commission to survey all the records in town archives, and they listed these detailed archives of Concord from 1717 on? And how is it that during the New Deal, the WPA employed people to go through the Concord archives, and they found the same records? But I could not find them anywhere. So we arranged with the students at Concord Carlisle High School with their teacher in AP US History to come on a Saturday, and we had permission to empty out the townhouse vault. And I promised them that I'd lead a little seminar on what you could do with these records, and I would instruct them on how to describe what they found. And we met in the morning, I don't know, 8 or 9 o'clock on a Saturday. And as we got close to noon, the vault was almost entirely emptied. And I was in despair. And then there were a couple cardboard boxes. And they were the last remaining boxes in the safe. Written in pencil was archives. We opened the boxes. It was everything that had been described by the previous generations of people surveying the records in Concord. So those are now, they have been in the library, but they're now the property of the town records. And so Beth has gotten to use them, spoiling my saying that I was exhaustive.
So I thank Bob and all those students. They're fabulous, yeah.
Thank you. Why has it taken until the 250th anniversary of the Revolution for the topic of slavery in New England to receive broader public attention?
I think I'd turn that around slightly, as Bob noted in his remarks. People have been writing about slavery
Yeah.
in New England since in major books since the 1940s. Maybe the question is, why is it that we prefer to forget it for long periods of time? And
Yes, exactly.
I'm not sure I understand why that happens.
Yes. I think we have to acknowledge there's a big gap between professional history
That's
and
true.
local history.
That's true, yeah.
And that at different points in time, the people who have wanted to document the local past might have been interested in their family's heritage, might have been interested in protecting a view of their community, and perhaps taking satisfaction. Slavery was in the South, it wasn't in New England. We don't, and that becomes a way to avoid self-examination. And we may be finally more interested and inclined to self-examination today, though again, our politics suggests we're hardly unanimous about this.
Yeah.
And that
So,
again soon.
that is a crucial thing, whether we want to know this past or not, affects whether we're going to invest in archiving that past, saving things.
Thank you. Did you want me to go to the next question?
Yeah, go to the next.
Okay, go to the next question. Some argue that slavery or enslavement in New England was less brutal than in the South, in that enslaved individuals were generally treated just like family. Is that true?
I guess I'd like to take that one, because I wrote my whole book and I didn't quite know how I wanted to finish it. And with your indulgence, I'd like to read you what I got out of all that I had written, the atrocities, the crying over slaves, whatever the master wanted to inflict. And so this is what I concluded. Many historians contend that slavery in Massachusetts was more humane than slavery in the southern colonies. Most Massachusetts enslaved persons did not live substantially different lives from those of their white masters with regard to their daily activities. Slaves and masters, and this is rural slavery because I do talk about the fact that it was different. Slaves and masters often worked together, lived together, went to the same churches, and shared many hardships. However, no enslaved person could live with a family of his choosing or have the freedom to make his own decisions. Few in number, they were isolated from a natural need to associate with others who shared similar circumstances. In addition, being recognized as a person, but classified as an animal or a piece of furniture for tax purposes or in probate records can only be construed as enforcing and perpetuating fundamental inequality. To watch a child being sold away, or to be sold away and your child left behind, or to be denied the right to live with a spouse is dehumanizing. Slavery was an atrocity, whether in the South or the North, a life not of one's own making, but controlled by others. And that's how I feel, so.
Yeah, I'd pick up on that theme as well. if what matters to people, and I think it does matter deeply to people, is the ability to form affectionate bonds in family. And in the South, because having slaves produce more slaves was an important part of the economy of the South, and the plantation systems generally had larger populations of enslaved people. It actually was possible in many instances for families more or less to stay together and for mothers and fathers to have their children with them, at least for some considerable period of time, always facing the prospect that at some point in the year or in their lifetimes they might be separated. Here in New England, you're almost guaranteed that you would never live with your spouse and you would not see your children grow up. So if those are the things that are deeply meaningful to people, then enslavement in New England was certainly far more cruel at the emotional level than it probably was in the South. I also would like to know, the New England definition of family can be misunderstood. Every person in New England was supposed to live in a household headed by a male. Mm-hmm. Everybody who was in that household was family. And so to be told, as we now interpret it now, oh, they were treated just like family. How do you know that? Well, they refer to this person as finally leaving their family. That doesn't mean anything. They may just simply have been sold. It is not family in the same sense in which I've yet to come across any. Well, there's a few indications where there were clearly close emotional bonds between enslavers and the enslaved, but not as many as you would think, given the intimacy of the way in which they lived most of their lives. So I think it's, well, I'm stunned by the cruelty of New England slavery.
I think one of the big issues is that we only hear one voice primarily, and that's the white male voice.
Yeah.
We do not hear anything from the enslaved people, who I'm sure could give a whole new perspective than any of us have from either reading town records or even something as intimate as Reverend Loring's journals. The fact is, we hear nothing. And it's certainly, I can speak for Sudbury, but there are no documents that record words. I mean, you can suggest some, you can imagine some, but there are none to say this is how someone enslaved actually felt.
Were New England blacks allowed to read, though? Were they taught to read, or is that something I just heard?
No, it's, yes, you could learn to read.
Yes.
She asked whether the enslaved were given the opportunity to read or were taught reading.
They certainly weren't prevented. I mean, everyone could read scriptures if they wanted. There wasn't any law against it. I think writing was much more infrequent than reading, but reading was something you could read the Bible. So certainly there was no law that prevented an enslaved person from learning how to read. Let's put it that way.
One of the justifications among whites for slavery in New England was that these black people were being brought to Christianity. Mm-hmm. And that required being able to read the Bible. But the fact that we hear from time to time, Cotton Mather is a good example, railing against slave owners for not bringing their slaves to Christianity raises at least some question on some parts about whether in fact reading was being allowed. In Lincoln, I think the black children probably went to the same public school that the white children did up to a certain age. And the apprenticeships that Mary Oliver's children were put into did include the requirement that the apprentices be taught to read. So.
One more question, I'm sorry, about that, the same thing. Now, you were saying they did not learn how to write, though? Was it possible for them to communicate over all those miles by writing?
Do you want to repeat the? Yeah.
She just asked whether they were able to or were taught at least some way to communicate through writing, because one of her questions is, and of course was brought up especially by Don's presentation, how did they communicate? In the case of the courtships that he described, how did they stay in touch?
Well,
He wants it.
nobody saved their letters, apparently.
In 18th century America, reading and writing were considered different skills. And so reading was taught generally, but writing was considered mainly a male skill, taught particularly to merchants who would have their clerks keeping records. And it would be unlikely, not as one might argue about the South, to teach blacks how to write so they could write passes for themselves. This would have probably been more an aspect of the general, if you will, segregation by gender as well as by other factors so the women, girls, were typically not taught how to write, but they were taught how to read. We might say more broadly something we haven't remarked on, which is that in Massachusetts, the enslaved people could own property, could testify in court against whites, as well as, might get schooling, and in that, and could claim, and could marry, and claim the legal right to marriage. There's a new book out by Gloria Whiting called Belonging on families in Massachusetts, which is quite powerful in its presentation and shows that actually blacks were able to leverage those legal rights they did have to claim a lot more space for themselves than you would think.
Thank you so much, and I just want to note, and it's not on the calendar yet, but Gloria Whiting actually has agreed to present. She is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's not able to travel at this time because just had a child. But she is going to present to us virtually at some future soon date, I hope, on her book, Belonging. So we'll look forward to that, and please watch our calendar. Maybe I'll just ask one final question, and then if you had any other questions. Did the fate of the enslaved in our communities change with the American Revolution after April 19?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Not least, as I mentioned, during the war, black men who went into the Army, for example, when they finished their service, were given a travel allowance in an amount so they could return to the place where they were recruited. But nobody monitored where they went, and there's probably more than one who just simply wandered off to wherever. The monitoring of black lives before the revolution could be pretty intense because you knew who your neighbors were, you know who was supposed to be where and when. During the war, there are people moving all over the place. You've got no idea who they are, where they're supposed to be. It's not really in your interest to stop them on the road and start asking, are you free or not? And who is your where should you be? So yeah, during the revolution, you could free yourself and wander off, and a significant fraction of people did exactly that.
I'd like to say something about Sudbury, because this was one of the surprises in my book, that I had spent so many years in Concord thinking of enslaved people, and if they married, they tended to marry other enslaved or freed people. That was not true in Sudbury when I came to look at it. the relationship was to the Natick praying Indian town, which abutted Sudbury. And there were certainly, and so almost all of the Revolutionary War people of color from Sudbury had ties to the Natick community. And even before that, if you married a free Native American woman and you were an enslaved man and you had children, those children were free. So that was, and I was in complete shock to realize, and I looked at past records, very little could I find of earlier records, but I'm sure that this was a continuing relationship that so far the story has not been told.
Yeah.
And I'll say for Concord, there are a number of patriots of color that are from other towns that fight with people from Concord. And then a lot of them wind up moving here at some point in time. So it's like, how do they learn about Concord? How do people, come here to our town? And I think it's because they were in the military with people from Concord and they talked it up. Just, it's gotta be a good place, right? Just like today.
Yeah. Ray, did you have a question?
Yes, your viewpoint on President Trump's document on Thursday in terms of restoring truth and sanity to American history. I would appreciate hearing what you think will happen in the next year.
We can only pray.
Repeat the question.
Please.
His question relates to Don's reference to the fact that our current administration would like to restore our interpretation and view of American history and greatness, and has given directives to institutions including the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, and some of the federal granting institutions to consider those new interpretations. And his question, excuse me? And the zoo, of course. Yes, the giraffes, I said, must be too tall. And the question was, how do we see this playing out in these next years? And maybe what we can all do, maybe on the local level, to make sure we keep telling our history.
Ray, I'm inclined toward, I think Yogi Berra's remark, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. I just think the re-understanding of the place of particularly slavery and black people in American life has now rooted itself so deeply that it strikes me that there will be massive public resistance to the notion that we're suddenly going to go back to an understanding which had its birth shortly after the Civil War, and we hope is long since behind us. I just can't believe we're going back in that direction, no matter what somebody scrawls with a marker pen on a piece of paper.
I would just add that if we're going to celebrate American greatness, we can give our own definition. American greatness lies in our capacity for self-criticism and our ability to change, in our founding principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in our dedication to realizing them and to be great on a moral scale. Trump says he wants us to promote American greatness. So let's define it as we want.
Thank you. I might say his argument, though, is that he gets to define what American greatness is. My question would be a corollary just to ask is what is the burden on the historian at this point to make certain that regardless of executive edict, what gets archived, what gets preserved, and how the truths that we've learned get relayed to the future? Thank you.
Here, here. Anka?
Yes, somebody-
Well, I'm just thinking that one of the things that I found in working on Lincoln was to encounter not very many, but at least a few black people who were also interested in this history. And we're swapping stories about where are the records, how do you find them, how do you write it up, and so on. I hope that interest burgeons. And part of my book, I intended two things. One of them was that it should be really engaging for a general audience. I wasn't going to write an academic book, and Bob Gross knows what I mean by that. But I also wanted to make certain that I left all the breadcrumbs. So if somebody else wanted to go to it, they'd know where it is. So the end notes are 150 pages. But there's some real gems in there. And anybody who wants to trace, where do I go next with the story you've told me so far? It's there. They can go to it. And all of us are doing that, I think.
Yes, I have 30 pages in my appendix where I didn't have enough story, but I put where I got the information, noted where you can go pursue it, hoping that more will turn up. I'm not the youngest person in the world, so I certainly went through a lot to set up people who want to continue this and encourage anyone who wants to look into it. But I have named countless sources, and my favorite hope is that some of them will be continued. So thank you.
I think that will conclude today's program. And thank you so much for our incredible panel and Robert Gross's opening and participation. I'm so grateful for this time, and I hope you are too. Thank you so much for coming.